So we're talking about indicators, and I'm going to go back to the way we deal with indicators, and everyone deals with it a little bit differently. I've just used the SMART acronym. Specific meaning it relates to a problem that needs solving. It's something that's going to help us. Measurable means you need to be able to quantify it. Assignable, who's going to do it, when, how. Realistic, what is it supposed to achieve? And then timely, has to happen in a timely fashion. So in my opinion, coarse filter indicators actually are really good ones because the alignment between the problem to be solved, or what we're trying to do, and forest management is really, really good. So I'll use overall residual vegetation within disturbance events as an example of what I think is a good one. So we believe residual vegetation levels within events are inconsistent with natural patterns. There's not enough, there's no variation. That's what we believe. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve with this indicator. The measurables, I'm going to borrow from some of the FMPs and a little bit from the CBFA. We could say we're going to use the quartiles, all 4 of them, of the percent of the event area that survives. So just overall forest area and a frequency distribution, and take the quartiles. And then you compare 1-to-1 from a measurement that either comes from, so we can develop NRV, and actually we have NRV for this already. And then you can measure it from a GIS exercise, a drone, high-res resolution, field measurements. So there's options there. Assignable, forest management companies could measurement, the regulator could audit. In terms of realistic, what we're trying to do is emulation, approximation, whatever the appropriate word is there, at fine scales. So this is one of potentially many indicators at fine scales. And then I would suggest this one could be measured and reported every 5 years, because doing it 1 by 1, you can't compare it to a distribution. So you need enough samples for a distribution. So that's my version of a really good indicator, and it's smart. So there's the quartiles, there's NRV, and then in terms of the filtering process, and this is one of the things I learned from the EBM dialogue sessions, is there any reason, cultural, economic, or ecological, that this distribution couldn't be adopted? And for the sake of argument, let's say no. There's going to be situations where we want to leave not many residuals. There will be others where we want to leave a lot, and it can balance out on a landscape. So for the sake of argument, let's say no. There's no reason why this indicator can't go ahead. And here's the Mistahay again, and just showing how that plays out. So let's take event size as an indicator. So we think harvesting events are inconsistent with natural patterns, generally too small and not enough variation. So that's our problem. We can take quartiles of event sizes using a GIS exercise. Forest management companies, same thing for assignable. Same thing here, emulate Mother Nature at mesoscales, measured and reported every 5 years. So more or less following the same template. So my question is, are we emulating Mother Nature at mesoscales using event size? If we take a look at NRV for event sizes, I came up with 2 here, one for Alberta and one for northern Saskatchewan, and this is by area burnt, not numbers. And you'll see that the vast majority of the area is in the very large fire events. So is this something that we can emulate? Well, when we go through the filtering process for fire size, there are certainly cultural, economic, and other ecological reasons for creating events that are larger, cultural events, harvesting events larger than 10,000 hectares. And the list includes water, water concerns about the amount of roading that would be required, social acceptance. We're still, especially if we're still calling them clear cuts of larger than 10,000 hectares. Ontario learned that lesson the hard way in their emulation guidelines. Economically, it would take maybe 30 years to harvest an event that was several tens of thousands of hectares. So there are definitely some barriers. In general, I don't know of any guidelines in the boreal that allow for any events larger than 10,000 hectares, and most are smaller. The BC Biodiversity Guidelines maxes out at 1,000. In Ontario, there's a way of getting events larger than 10 or up to 10,000 hectares, but it's difficult to do. But certainly nothing larger than 10,000 hectares. So we're not approximating this distribution. So is that good enough? So we have moved the yardsticks, right? You think, well, we're still getting closer to Mother Nature, because it used to be a checkerboard pattern, and now we've at least gone up to 10,000 hectares. And we think, well, we must be doing, we must be doing better. The text from the Quebec guidelines is, closer to Mother Nature. So that's, certainly the case. Now, this is an analysis that was done in northeastern BC in the subboreal, and it shows 5 indicators of pattern using 5 different scenarios. The historic outlined in red there. Can you guys see my my arrow when I'm pointing?
Yeah, and it's good.
Can you? Oh,
Yeah,
good. That's
it's good. It's very, yep,
that's
it's
good.
clear.
That's good to know. Okay, thank you. So yeah, this red line here is NRV, and then what I did is in the model simply said you can't have fires larger than 10,000, 3,000, 1,060, and then took measurements and ran it, 100 times for each one of them. So average patch size, and of course it's highly skewed, but it's still interesting. It maxes out at 39 and it drops all the way down to 23, and then even, between the 10,000 and the 60, it's really not moving much. It's really not doing anything. The standard deviation of patch size is more of a measure of the range, and of course, the larger it is in this case, it's saying, you're when it dips below, this NRV, saying you're not getting the big ones. So it's more of an even landscape. Edge density goes up. Total core area, this is one that drops significantly. It drops by 10% just at the 10,000 hectare limit. It still drops, below that, but not nearly as much. So essentially the bottom line here, and evenness index Simpsons, that's just a measure of diversity. So we're getting simpler landscapes. That's what these numbers all mean here, between 0.79 and 0.84. So most of the difference is occurring above that 10,000 hectare limit. So are we really creating significantly more natural landscapes by using something like event size? So here's a toy image of what's happening. So here's 15% of this green area is disturbed, and there's one big fire and a couple of small ones, and I didn't put in the little tiny ones. And here is an upper size limit of, let's say, 3,000 hectares. Now, when there's an upper size limit of 3,000 hectares, and this is a big caveat, if you're not saying where they're going to be, if they could be anywhere across the landscape, then there's no mechanism for clustering them. Then essentially what you have is you're just fragmenting the landscape on a much larger scale. We used to do it at 40 and 60 hectare blocks, and now we're doing it at 1,000 and 3,000 hectare events. And if they are uniformly distributed across the landscape, then you still are creating landscapes that have less core area, less opportunity for large patches, and ultimately you're going to have more roads. So the 10,000 hectare limit does have an implication. So I think down here, the realistic part, I don't think it's realistic. I don't think event size all by itself is very realistic. We're not emulating Mother Nature at meso scales, or we're doing it marginally better than we were before. It's not a good indicator. So if we take a closer look at the differences in terms of space, we've got patches that are, or fires that are less than a hectare, and we definitely have ones that are over 1 million. The current range, economically, we're really not going to be harvesting anything less than about 10 hectares, and that's an economic limitation. It's not really a significant gap because we still have small fires. Less than 10,000 hectares, you've got social and ecological issues there. It is a significant gap. Now, in terms of time, fires happen, an hour. I've seen fires, that last 30 minutes and they go out, up to weeks, and on rare occasions they overwinter and they can be multiple years. But in terms of being able to mechanically harvest an area, it could be, weeks to months. On vast areas, we could be talking decades. And then, of course, linear features, we don't have any. Roads are required, and there's a gap there. So what if we reframed what the question is in terms of these parameters? So it's not event size that we're talking about here. It's what I call the space-time footprint. Harvest events occur over space and time, and we've got the time footprint off a little bit here. So it's not individual events, it's how much disturbance there is in a given area over a given period of time. So let's reframe that and call it the space-time footprint. And then we can create quartiles of that. So how might that play out? So what I did is if we throw a grid on top of this original toy model, we can see that the more natural pattern, we have about half the cells that are undisturbed. The same area of that other toy model where I maxed out at 3,000 hectares, only 4% of these grids are undisturbed. Okay, so that's a pattern we probably should be paying attention to. So where do we get NRV for this? If we can grid fire activity on a landscape, this is northern Saskatchewan, where there hasn't been fire control and there's still good spatial records. So what I did is through, in this case, a 10,000 hectare grid over northern Saskatchewan, and then for a 20-year period measured how much of each 10,000 hectare cell burnt. Okay, and it's cumulative. It can never be more than, sorry, it's a net number. So it can never be more than the size of the cell. If there's 8,000 hectares of forest in a cell and it all burns, or burned 3 times, it could still only be 8,000 hectares. So you could look at it the other way and say, at the end of a 20-year period, how much didn't burn would be the reciprocal of that. Okay, so here is an average amount over a 20-year period, 10,000 hectares. The darker red are areas where more than 75% of the cells burnt here. And there's an awful lot of areas that are white, and those are 38% of the area. So despite the fact that we had a fair amount of disturbance activity here, and I keep in mind northern Saskatchewan, we've got a 70 to 80 year fire cycle. This is 20 years, so we would have about a quarter of it burning. We still have 38% of the cells where there was no fire activity. So this, I'm proposing, is NRV for a space-time fire pattern that we could use and could become a robust indicator. So what would that look like? So here's an example of a comparison of NRV that I generated for Northern Alberta, and there it is in green again, and there's still a lot of cells that have no disturbance, a bunch of cells that have a high amount of disturbance, right? So you get this difference, and it's going to look a lot like this map. In the blue, oops, in the red is the actual measurement on a pilot test area on the ALPAC FMA. And I think the important thing here is there were no cells where there's no disturbance at all. There's an awful lot of cells that have a little bit of disturbance, and there's no cells that have a lot of disturbance. So we're spreading disturbance out across really, really large scales. That's the message. So how might you use, okay, so here's an example of, back to our 51% and our 4%, right? Here, that's what this graph is telling us, right? So this image here is represented by, the green, and the red is more like the one on the right here. Okay, so that's what's happening to our landscapes. And a fire size indicator will say we're doing just fine, and we're not. So how could we use this? And this is a part of a larger discussion and maybe a whole other talk. But I'll just throw out one idea, is if we just focused on the extremes, it would start us in the right direction. We have no zeros, we have no areas where there's a huge amount of disturbance. So if we start pushing these red bars this way to the left and start to get some zeros, and we start pushing these ones further this way to the right, we're going to have more of a natural distribution. And this is an example of actually the Stony pilot study that we did for ALPAC and SEMA. And the red ones are the areas where we proposed we would have a lot of disturbance, and the green ones where we would have no disturbance for a set amount of time. And just one possible way of interpreting this. But as I say, I think there's a lot of others. In any case, we've got NRV. We can compare it, in the green in this case, we can compare it to our current condition, and it tells us that there is a gap, and we can imagine from this that we are going to have some, if not already, have some significant issues. And again, fire size will not pick this up. So again, here's a part of what we talked about, how we would use this. This is not in a grid formation, but the same idea. The wheres are the ones where harvest activity, cultural disturbance activity would focus, and then the wins are where you're not, and you would stay out of those, and those would be your zeros. And if you don't have any zeros, you could use restoration of linear features to create them. So that's the concept to the practice. I'm not going to go any further with this because I think I've thrown a lot at you already. But I will point out that the NRV part of this is really important because it's going to change based on 3 factors. And the data can be regenerated to suit all of them. So you're going to have different historic fire cycles. If you're going to use this idea, for example, in the foothills compared to the ALPAC FMA or the Mystic FMA, you don't want to be using the same data because you have fire cycles that are 100 years versus 60 years. And the NRV, the time-space pattern is going to change. You can also match the time frames with this with ones that are handy for forest management. So in the examples I showed you, I used a 20-year window, but you can reformulate the data for 10 years, 50 years, 5 years. It doesn't matter. So NRV can be recreated using the same data at any time frame. And the same thing with grid cells. If there is a grid size or even If you wanted to use watersheds instead of grids, you can impose any spatial pattern you want of any size, and you can recreate this.